And so then that brings us to this point of when we talk about progressive nearsightedness or progressive myopia. So the goal is, the very first goal is we need to make sure that we're not getting these kids to develop nearsightedness. But once they develop it, then the goal becomes, okay, how can we slow down the progression? We don't want it to continue to get worse and worse. And so that becomes the issue. And so I also remember clinically, we used to say, if your child only changes about a half a unit of prescription per year, that's kind of the norm. Well, we now know that that's also no longer what we want, right? Because what we're seeing is that these kids are changing from 1 unit to 2 units, sometimes 3 units within a year period. So anything more than a half a unit, we definitely worry about that this is becoming progressive nearsightedness. And so we want to stick to the fact that this half a unit per year, it's still no longer valid. And that's what's kind of become now. That's why this, this whole, literally we call it amongst our medical community, especially in the visual community, that the nearsightedness of the myopia pandemic. And it's because it used to be that only 5% of the worldwide population was nearsighted. But now, depending on where we look, if we look in China, where they're very digital, very technology driven, about 90% of the population is nearsighted. If we look in the US, it went from 5% to today is about 42%. And so the concern is that by 2050, half of the world will become nearsighted. And in actuality, I don't think that we took into account when that projection was made. I don't think we took into account the fact that we were going to use more and more technology, especially with the pandemic that happened last year that kind of supercharged it. And I actually think that's going to happen even sooner than 2050. And so why should we, why should we be concerned about the nearsightedness? Well, nearsightedness is a little bit different when we look at it from a functional point of view compared to farsightedness. If I'm farsighted, I can't see very well at near, so it might impact my reading and my learning, but I can still walk around, I can cross the street, so it's not as big of a safety issue. When we talk about nearsightedness, it's different, right? I might have difficulty crossing the street. I might not be able to specifically judge how far away a car is. So it really impacts our independence. Definitely it impacts our ability in school. We know that 80% of what is absorbed in the classroom comes through the visual pathways, looking at the blackboard, being able to look at the teacher, looking at the facial expressions when someone's talking to you and responding appropriately, learning to get along with each other. And so that becomes different when the nearsighted, it impacts us at a totally different, it makes us a more, more dependent on others. Hey, can you read across the board? What does that say? I can't copy my notes from the blackboard. And so that becomes really important. And definitely in sports, right? The sports are very, very distance driven. So a nearsighted child is going to definitely have more difficulty with sports than a farsighted child. And so definitely, wearing glasses or things like that are going to make us feel self-conscious about it. I'm wearing my glasses now and I'm beyond that. But when kids are little, that can become an issue. And so again, talking about when the concern, right, that we as doctors, we thought about a half a unit per year, that's okay, right? But if we do that math now and your child is 5 and they're half a unit already when they're 5 years of age, and they continue to go on that trajectory with half a unit per year, by the time they're 17, they're very likely going to end up to be a -6. And why is this important, right? Why is intervention important? Well, what happens physically to the eye is that a nearsighted eye or a myopic eye is physically larger. So when we talk about farsighted eyes, we said these are when they're eyes that are smaller because they're not fully formed. So a farsighted eye is smaller than a non-nearsighted or farsighted eye, but the nearsighted eye is way bigger than both of those. And so it is physically a ball that is larger. And so what happens, the concern becomes that the lining of the tissues of the eye are made up of about the same number of cells, whether I'm nearsighted or not. And so if I'm not nearsighted and I physically have a smaller eyeball and you're nearsighted and you physically have a larger eyeball, what's going to happen that both of us have the same number of cells that make up the lining. Your cells for your nearsighted eye have to be pulled and stretched to cover a larger surface area. And so that by its own nature, automatically putting these cells, that pulling and stretching, it puts them in a position of greater physical stress. And it puts them in a position where now these children that are nearsighted are at higher risk of developing sight-threatened situations where the tissues can actually break, tear, or degenerate. And we see that the clinical research shows us that if I'm only about 1.25 units of nearsightedness, I have about 2 times the likelihood of developing a retinal detachment. But if I'm 6 units of nearsightedness, that goes up to 21.5% of developing a retinal detachment. That's significant. And we see the same kind of issue when myopic maculopathy specifically means that the lining of the eye is just too thin. And it's specific to the area that has the sharpest area of central vision. And so that's why we talk about that this becomes a sight-threatening situation that we become very concerned about, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean it'll happen right away, but it certainly puts your child now at risk, for a greater risk for the development of these sight-threatening conditions when they become adults. And so what are the things that make, my child at a higher risk? For sure, we know that, again, we reiterate that depending on where your prescription is, and how that corresponds with your age is a big deal. We look at 9 years of age. We don't want anyone ideally to be nearsighted before the age of 9. If they're constantly doing excessive work at near, and we know that because even if the kids are in school, they're still using a lot of computers and a lot of devices in school. Definitely that's going to limit the amount of time that you spend outdoors. And we see that there's clinical research that definitely shows us that the less amount of time the kids spend outdoors is going to impact their likelihood of developing nearsightedness. And then definitely, so these are all kind of environmental factors. We can try to talk about and do some modifications to the environment to try to control those things. The things that we cannot control is our genetics. So if our parents are already nearsighted, so by just general risk, everyone is at 25% risk of developing nearsightedness just by due to environmental factors. When we add the component that one of my parents is also nearsighted, that 25% now goes up to 50%. And if both of my parents are nearsighted, that 50% now goes up to 66%. So knowing that if you personally are nearsighted, your child has a very, very high risk of developing nearsightedness. So being more proactive about that. And definitely ethnicity. We don't know exactly why. We don't know if it's because, ethnically, again, we see that in China, they're more technology driven. So we don't know if it's more the environment because of how their lifestyle is, but definitely we see it that it's more of a higher incidence in Asian, East Asia patients. And those same factors not only play at the risk of your child developing the nearsightedness, these are the same factors that impact the progression of the nearsightedness if your child is already nearsightedness. But the positive side is that being informed is always the best thing, that we can make wise decisions. And so we do have options. We're going to talk individually about each one of these. And so there are definitely things we can do.